Some of these replies I have chosen for this program, and the first is right on his beam. The subject is the American personality.
They're not satisfied just to see something funny. They have to see significance in it, and we had never planned on having any significance in anything we ever did. We were just trying to make the audience laugh. And I remember there was a show in New York open called Bandwagon. This was a musical with Frank Morgan, and the Astairs were in there. And Frank Morgan came out before the curtain, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know there's a lot of plays in New York with social significance. Don't regard this as one of them. All we're going to try to do here is to make a little money." There was one fella, he was a wonderful writer. The day after we opened in Animal Crackers on Broadway, he wrote a piece, mostly about me, in which he said that I was the embodiment of the Jewish oppression that had gone on for 2,000 years. It's the goddamnedest kind of reviewing. As I said, well, all we were trying to do was be funny, and he had everything in there. He had hunks of the Bible in there and everything. Now, we were astonished by this. Later, I had somebody explain it to me, but we didn't understand it at all. But people do that. They review books, too, sometimes, which are just meant to be comic or funny, and they see all kinds of things in that really don't exist except in their own minds.
Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast. This week, Ken sits down for an insightful conversation with Harvard Kennedy School professor of International Affairs, Dr. Stephen Walt.
Stephen, Walt, thank you so much for being on our podcast this week. Really appreciate it. It's been a while since we've talked. Just to get started, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? I think most of them will be familiar with you, but just give us a little nutshell bio.
Nutshell bio is I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where I've been for 20 years. Before that, I taught for 10 years at the University of Chicago. And before that, for 5 years at Princeton. I got my PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and my undergraduate degree from Stanford. I've now spent what's become a pretty long career writing about international politics and foreign policy from essentially a realist perspective, although I try not to be too narrowly bound by any particular intellectual outlook. And I've had a remarkably fortunate career.
Well, tell us a little bit, when you say a realist perspective, what can you define that?
Well, realism is a body of thought about international politics and to some extent politics in general that places the emphasis on power, and in particular argues that in a world where there is no central authority, there's no world government to keep order, maintain peace, that nation states and especially powerful countries will be inevitably forced to compete for power in various ways to pursue their national interests as they see them. Realism is a pretty gloomy view of international affairs, suggesting competition is always there, the danger of war is always present. But ironically, realists in the United States have tended to actually be somewhat dovish in the sense that they've tended to argue against grand crusades. Realists were opposed to the Vietnam War for the most part. Realists were very skeptical and opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So in a sense, we've been voices of prudence in American foreign policy rather than voices in favor of endless American expansion or intervention as well.
Okay, and then this is probably a dumb question, but when I hear the term realism, I sometimes think of Henry Kissinger or Brent Scowcroft, and as far as I can tell, you're not in that camp. But am I wrong? I thought they were also called realists.
Yeah, realism is something of a big tent, and we don't agree on everything. I actually think my views are not that far off from the views of someone like Brent Scowcroft. Particularly later in his career, very much a apostle of prudence in American foreign policy. You may remember that before the 2003 Iraq War, Scowcroft actually wrote an op-ed piece opposing the war, saying it was a bad idea.
I didn't remember that actually, so that's good to know.
It was actually controversial because many people thought he was serving as kind of an avatar for George W. Bush's father, with Scowcroft, who's very close. Kissinger is an odd case because I think if you look at sort of most realists and then you look at Kissinger, Kissinger is a very odd realist. He has this reputation for being, hard-nosed, not interested in human rights, sees the world in very dark and competitive terms, and to some degree that's consistent with realism. But he also believed in a world, where bandwagoning was common, where credibility was all important, where the United States had to fight in places that didn't matter, like Vietnam, in order to convince the world that it would fight in places that did matter, like Europe. So within the realist world, actually, Kissinger is something of an outlier, even in his sort of intellectual predilections. And of course, Kissinger also supported a lot of the interventions that other realists opposed, including the war in Iraq in 2003.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm maybe missing something, but I can't think of many interventions he didn't support, actually.
Right. Well, my view on Kissinger is that he has always been someone who thinks that things could go south very quickly, that no matter how the United States was, no matter how many allies we had around the world, no matter how good the world looked, that if you slipped up at all, if you made the slightest misstep, if there was some challenge you failed to respond to, that everything could unravel very quickly.
Right.
And that therefore the United States had to be endlessly vigilant. Right? It didn't matter if we were the most powerful country. It didn't matter if we had enormous innate security because we were in the Western Hemisphere and had no enemies nearby. Everything could really, as I said, unravel quickly. And that forced Kissinger, given his worldview, into this almost hypersensitivity about challenges. And he's really never changed in that regard. That's been consistent in his post-political career, that he remains, I think, as someone who sees the world in very dark, gloomy, foreboding terms in ways that are somewhat contrary to what many other American realists have seen about America's position, where it allows us to take a somewhat more measured view of international affairs because, in fact, we're in remarkably good shape compared to other powers.
Right. Do you think that Kissinger, I mean, let's focus on him for just a second more, because one could ask this about many members of the foreign policy elite, but Kissinger, do you think his views at all are shaped by his own personal financial interests? I mean, in China, he's always had a pretty extensive role. He's been sort of, as I understand it, an unofficial advisor to the Chinese government. I mean, he originally helped Nixon broker, key player in brokering the opening with China, but then he became a door opener for companies wanting to do business over there. Do you think that, we don't even have to make this Kissinger specific, but do you think it's somewhat common that members of the foreign policy elite, that their views become somewhat intertwined with their personal financial interest, or am I being too cynical?
Well, I'm sure that's true of a number of people as well. Intellectuals and foreign policy experts are not immune to temptation. And if there's a large paycheck at the end of some relationship, the tendency to try and preserve that is going to be there, and it's going to require real strength of character to get people to resist that. I think that Kissinger, undoubtedly, some of his views on various subjects have at least been attenuated by where he saw long-term relationships, including financial relationships. My own view is that the ambivalence that runs through his very long book on China, with that title, where he, on the one hand, understands that China is an emerging rival and needs to be taken seriously, and it does, again, have a sort of Kissingerian dark view there, but that's also coupled with this view that, if smart people manage this relationship, all will be well, and we don't want to be too confrontational. I think the biggest problem that academics or intellectuals or foreign policy experts get into when their financial interests or other interests get tied into what they're doing is not so much that they necessarily write things just because they're told to or just because there's a paycheck, although that probably happens from time to time, but it's what they don't say. It's what you decline to say, decline to write because you're worried about closing doors or slamming shut opportunities, and that's probably true of many people within the foreign policy world and probably in other areas of public policy as well.
No, I mean, there's no question about that. I remember years ago, I mean, I can't even, it's probably going on 20 years. I was talking with a guy who was a deputy assistant secretary of state or something under Clinton, I believe, Whitney Schneiderman, who was interviewing while he was in government. And he was very, very critical of the Angolan government, which, rightly critical. I mean, terribly corrupt regime, and, where Dos Santos, the president, promised elections for years and years and inevitably found a reason to cancel them. Anyway, I talked to Schneiderman right after he left his job at the State Department, and I thought, well, great, now this guy's going to be able to talk very openly. So I contacted him and asked him if he could, go on the record now and talk about his disdain for the Angolan government. And he shyly and really annoyingly, to put it mildly, said, well, now that I'm in the private sector, he went to work as a lobbyist, of course. He said, I really can't talk about the Angolans at this point. So I certainly have seen instances where people who are, and on the one hand, sure, you can understand that, and on the other hand, it's pretty intellectually dishonest to bury your views in the hope, and especially when you have contempt for a government, and then you think, well, I may be able to cash in. After all, they've got a ton of oil money. They hire lobbyists, and so his views, suddenly he became very quiet. But anyway, let me ask a probably ridiculously broad question, and I promise not to take too much of your time. We'll try to keep this to 30 minutes. I know you've got to be busy. But the broad question I wanted to run by you and then ask you some more specific stuff is, what do you think of Trump's foreign policy in general? Not every aspect of it, but just in a general critique. And is it distinctly different from Obama's? And if there is a distinct difference, which of the two do you prefer? Or are you a critic of both or a fan of both?
Well, I was a critic of both. I am a critic of the Trump administration, but I was also, perhaps you might call me a sympathetic critic of the Obama administration. I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy at the very end of the Obama administration, the end of the second term, basically suggesting that Obama had been a failure as a foreign policy president. He'd done some other, I think, impressive things, certainly helping the American economy recover from the financial crisis of 2008 and a number of other positive things. But I thought in foreign policy, it was a net negative. So I was not a partisan defender of our former president. So in terms of Trump, I mean, there's a lot to say here. His governing style, of course, across the board is one we've never seen before. We've never seen a president act in the way that he does, and that includes the way he handles foreign policy. It by twig, doing it with these personal spats he gets into with foreign leaders, where he treats them with, disdain and contempt. But then in some cases declares, a few months later that he's fallen in love with them, most notoriously in the case of Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So in the terms of just the style, also the chaos within the Trump administration, where there's been tremendous turnover in the foreign policy management. He's now on his third national security advisor, his second CIA director, his second Secretary of State, lots of unfilled positions. We don't have a current Secretary of Defense. We have an acting Secretary of Defense, things like that. And the sense of tremendous churn. That's all very different. But if you look at the actual substance of Trump's policies, things have not changed as much as you might think. And I don't want to suggest they haven't changed at all. But, for example, he's been very critical of NATO all along, but the United States is still in NATO. We're actually doing more in parts of Europe to try and bolster security against Russia. That's the second thing, right? Despite all of the suspicions about Trump's relations with Russia and all of that, our policy towards Russia is still very confrontational. We're still, basically unchanged. If anything, a tougher policy towards Russia than at the end of the Obama administration. In the Middle East, he's essentially kind of removed the hypocrisy from American Middle East policy. We have the same set of allies we had under Obama and Bush and Clinton, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. And he simply doubled down on all of those relationships. We've always been giving most of those countries pretty uncritical support, and now it's almost completely uncritical support. So that's not a sea change in U.S. policy. People talk about the steps he's taken with respect to moving the embassy in Jerusalem, in Israel, saying, annexation of the Golan Heights would be okay, stuff like that. And that's going to kill the peace process, to which I would say, what peace process?
Yeah.
No peace process to kill there. He has launched trade wars with a bunch of other countries, of course, but none of these have actually yet fundamentally altered our relations with the rest of the world. The trade deal with Canada and Mexico is basically a warmed over version of NAFTA. He may eventually get a trade deal with China that my guess is not going to be a sea change in that relationship either. Our policy towards Iran, right? The United States, he did leave the nuclear deal, but the nuclear deal was one of those issues that was always kind of a 51-49 thing in Washington, right? There was enormous opposition to that when Obama did it, and Trump has essentially just sided with the other side in what was a very evenly divided issue there. He sent more troops to Afghanistan, which, by the way, Barack Obama did in his first year as president. So, again, on lots and lots of issues, you see Trump ending up with policies that are not that different from his predecessors, even though the way in which he's approaching them is stylistically quite different. And last point I'd make here is I think you're also seeing that this is really, he's a fundamentally incompetent foreign policy manager. It makes sense to confront China over some of its trade practices, but the competent way to do that would be in alignment with the countries that we were in partnership with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, instead of leaving that deal, and to do it in partnership with our trading partners in Europe. Instead, what Trump has done is sort of started trade disputes with nearly everybody. So we end up confronting China essentially on our own. And I'd say much the same thing with respect to this maximum pressure campaign against Iran. Under the Obama administration, we had all of Europe, Russia, and China all working with us to control Iran's nuclear ambitions. And now, essentially, it's the United States all by itself, and with Saudi Arabia and Israel in tow, but without any of these other countries backing in what we're trying to accomplish there. So we're pouring gasoline into the Persian Gulf, starting to throw a few matches in there, but doing it entirely on our own. And that, to me, is just a sign that they really don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, it seems like in a variety of places. I mean, Venezuela springs to mind. They're really, they seem extraordinarily reckless and very unpredictable. And I interpret that in part to mean that, you've got various factions around the president, and the president is not, as far as I can tell, somebody who's studying the issues real hard, and so he may be persuadable. I find his policies in Venezuela to be appalling, and it looks like, well, there's rumors that Bolton may be on his way out, but to put guys like John Bolton and Elliott Abrams in positions like that they have in this administration And, to watch what they did in Venezuela, which appears to be failing, this attempt to overthrow the regime, which I think is a terrible idea, no matter what one thinks of the Venezuelan government. But it seems like, I don't know, Trump, you're sort of getting at this, but it's hard to predict what he's going to do, because I think, anyway, that, he doesn't know what he's going to do until he decides when he wakes up in the morning, and maybe, he's been persuaded one way or the other. And on the other hand, and let me get to a question, how, maybe I'm being stupid here. Maybe he is studying the issues, and maybe he specifically picked guys like Bolton and Elliot Abrams because he had decided he wanted to overthrow the Venezuelan government, and whether I like that or not, that was the policy. But what, in short, what do you think of his policy in Venezuela? And I presume you're not a huge fan of Bolton or Abrams. How do guys like that, when Trump campaigned on a completely different approach, how do neoconservatives like Bolton and Elliot Abrams get important positions and seem to be repeating? It's like Iran-Contra all over again.
There's several parts to this problem. The first thing to remember is Donald Trump didn't have a foreign policy brain trust when he decided to run. Mm-hmm. He had a couple of oddball advisors, people like Michael Flynn and Sebastian Gorka and others, but he didn't have a well-schooled team. And back in the 2016 campaign, of course, he was opposed by most of the stalwart figures in the Republican foreign policy establishment. There were these two prominent open letters signed by over 100 experienced Republican foreign policy experts declaring Trump unfit to be president back in 2016. And he, of course, these are the so-called never-Trumpers, and none of them, of course, ever got jobs in the Trump administration for all the obvious reasons. But that meant when he had to then staff up an administration, put people into positions, where is he going to go? He doesn't have an entourage. He doesn't have a team. And that's one of the reasons you end up with people like Bolton and Abrams who hadn't signed those letters, and therefore, Trump eventually could see his way to appointing them. So that's part of his problem. The second problem is that he has always said, Trump, that being unpredictable is good. I like being unpredictable. Mm-hmm. Of course, a classic sort of, con man's game, right? Never hold me accountable for what I said last week, because I'm bobbing and weaving. I'm constantly improvising. I don't think he has any really deeply well-formed views on foreign policy. And in a sense, his handling of foreign policy is much more like a reality TV show than it is like a disciplined, strategic approach to statecraft. As long as he can pretend that he's achieved some great victory, as long as he can tweet that out, as long as he can get people to talk about it as though it's a victory, the substance kind of doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And the only virtue in that is that he's actually able to reverse course if he makes mistakes with, I think, greater nimbleness than other presidents. The danger in that, of course, is he ends up making an awful lot of mistakes as well. With respect to Venezuela, I think it would be a good thing if the Maduro regime were removed or were replaced, but that should be done by the Venezuelan people, and that should be done through, I think, gradual nonviolent civil protests. And the one thing that will make that harder to achieve is if the United States is seen as leading the charge, which of course is the approach that Bolton and Abrams and to some degree Secretary Pompeo were taking. So, it's worse than a crime. It's a blunder, and it's less likely to yield the outcome that I think Venezuelans, for the most part, would benefit from, that all of the regional powers in Latin America would support, and that ultimately would be good for the United States as well. But it's not one of those things that we should be leading the charge on.
Right. Okay. I want to turn to a couple of your books. Before discussing your most recent book, I want to ask you about your book about the Israel lobby, which was, I think it's over a decade old, but caused a huge amount of controversy. And I wanted to ask you to briefly I know this is difficult to do quickly, but if you could lay out the main thesis of the book and why do you think it caused such a controversy? And then part three is I initially was, I remember we spoke when I was at Harper's Magazine, and I initially was critical about your book in some ways, but I feel like a lot of what you wrote has been borne out. But there's still, I just reread, Noam Chomsky wrote, you must have seen it back at the time. I think at the time it was, that book started out with, which you wrote with John Mearsheimer, as a London Review of Books article. And Chomsky said he agreed with lots of it, but he had a criticism, which was that you overemphasize the power of the Israel lobby, and that in fact, U.S. interest, and this is his critique, so I just want to hear your reply to it, because a lot of the critiques of your work, and particularly your work on the Middle East, I find ridiculous, because it's still difficult to rationally talk about Israel in this country. But Chomsky is not somebody who's afraid to criticize Israel, and he said that U.S. Middle East policy looks much the same like it does in Central America or Asia or anywhere else, and that it wasn't, Middle East policy wasn't driven by the Israel lobby, that it was driven by U.S. interest, and that you and John overemphasized the Israel lobby and suggested that there was something special going on there, where in fact it's typical of the way the U.S. operates, which is always, like any power does, where any small or great power looks to protect its own interests, and that Israel serves U.S. interests, but that Israel doesn't, and the Israel lobby don't formulate or drive U.S. policy as much as there may be a synergy, but U.S. interests predominate. Anyway, I asked you a lot there, but can you talk a little bit about your thesis and if you think it's held up, and Chomsky's critique?
So first of all, let me summarize. The basic argument of the book was that the United States relationship with Israel is unprecedented. We give Israel generous amounts of support, economic, military aid in particular, and also consistent diplomatic backing and protection in various forums like the United Nations, more than any other country, and no criticism within the American political system as well. No other relationship really quite like that. And that this is not explicable by strategic interests. It was not explicable by Israel being morally better than any other country. We didn't argue Israel was worse. We just said that it's no morally better. So the question is, how did you explain it? And we argued that it was the impact of an influential set of interest groups, not unusual in American politics, that worked very hard to sustain a special relationship between the United States and Israel. And again, that special relationship being one of essentially unconditional American support, so that even when the United States is trying to advance a peace process between Israel and the Palestinians, we can never threaten Israel, never put pressure on them, offer them more carrots, but never threaten sticks, even though Israel is much weaker and it requires it benefits greatly from American support. We argued that there was nothing conspiratorial about this. This wasn't some kind of secret cabal or anything. This was just interest group politics, like the farm lobby or the NRA or Big Pharma or any of these other well-organized groups. And there really wasn't much of an opposition. There wasn't a Palestinian lobby or a pro-Egyptian lobby or whatever on the other side of this. And that explained in part why this worked. And we've laid out in great detail how this operated and the effects that it had on American politics. On Chomsky's critique of us, I think he's just wrong about this one. First of all, the level of American involvement in the Middle East has been extraordinarily high and greater than in other parts of the world. We don't give countries in Central America the same kind of support that we gave, given Israel as well. But more importantly, if you look at American interests in the region, right, and you look at other institutions that have a big impact on American policy in various places, here American policy was actually at odds with what those institutions have been. The American military, for example, which Chomsky is often very critical of, and very critical of the military industrial complex in the Pentagon, American military has always been rather skeptical about this special relationship as well. They don't say it out loud, but they've been concerned about it. Certainly American defense contractors, especially 20, 30, 40 years ago, were actually concerned about this in part because it made it harder for them to sell weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia. Groups like ASAC, opposed the sale of AWACS back in the Reagan administration as well. American oil companies, of course, which Chomsky is also very critical of in various ways. American oil companies, didn't like the fact that we were so beholden to Israel. And, back when Dick Cheney was running Halliburton back in the 90s, big oil services firm, he used to talk about our sanctions-happy foreign policy, the fact that we had sanctions on countries like Iraq and sanctions on countries like Iran, which was, of course, a policy driven very much by groups like AIPAC, because that had prevented companies like Halliburton from making money in Iraq.
Right.
So I think if the military-industrial complex and big oil companies were running American foreign policy, then we'd have a very different policy than the one we had. And just last but not least, we argued that the impact of the lobby was bad for the United States, but also bad for Israel, because giving unconditional support had derailed the peace process in a variety of ways and was encouraging Israel to follow policies that we felt were ultimately harmful. And we thought that what we needed was a more open discussion of this issue. In the conclusion of the book, we actually talked for the creation of a different Israel lobby, one that was perhaps just as politically influential, but was advocating for smarter policies. And yes, you're right, the book was quite controversial. I think, it's been 12 years since the book was published, and I'm not objective on this, but I think we've been almost entirely vindicated. Nobody ever really challenged the evidence we presented in the book. The special relationship has continued despite the rightward shift in Israel, which disturbs many people here in the United States. But I think most importantly, the Obama administration was really a clear indication of what was going on. Obama is really serious about trying to get a peace agreement. He works very hard. John Kerry works very hard, and they basically get nowhere. You have spectacles like Benjamin Netanyahu coming to speak to a joint session of Congress and getting more standing ovations there than the president does.
Right.
And I think that just drove home to many people that we were, absolutely right. The one thing that has changed in this period is I think you've now seen a growing divide within the pro-Israel community in the United States. We do see the emergence of groups like J Street and some others as well, who have begun to recognize that there's something fundamentally wrong about this situation, and who want the United States to have a more sophisticated and nuanced policy, not an anti-Israel policy, but one that treats Israel like essentially a normal country, where we support them when they're doing things we approve of, and where we distance ourselves when they're doing things we disapprove of. I might add, I think that would be an excellent approach to the rest of the Middle East as well. We could treat all of the countries in the Middle East in that way, instead of having special relations with a few of them and no relationship at all with others.
Right. Okay. Well, I read I had read Chomsky's critique way back when and reread it and found it interesting and definitely thoughtful. But the points you make are, I can't think of a single thing you said that I disagree with. So I do largely agree with the thesis you laid out, and I mean that's a pretty persuasive argument. I mean, it is. There's no question that the United States does not have any ally like Israel. I mean, there's no country, particularly given its size, and particularly given the fairly horrible foreign policy it exercises, that gets a blank check to do whatever it wants, and it is a special case.
And the other thing to note about this is, right, it's one of the only countries in the world that gets hardly any criticism by American political figures. That's changed a little bit in the last couple of years, partly due to, I think, generational changes taking place here in the United States, but hardly any prominent political figures. Certainly no one who aspires to a foreign policy career in Washington would say anything significantly critical about that. And that's odd, right, in a country that prizes open debate, open discussion as well. Instead, as I expected and experienced, if you do criticize Israel, if you do criticize groups like AIPAC as well, not only do you get people disagreeing with you, you get the sort of vilest forms of character assassination being thrown as well. And that deters lots of people. And that's not true of, say, Germany, Japan, Thailand, Guatemala, Brazil, any other country in the world. It's that, in that sense, the way in which discourse has been policed on this subject is really quite unusual.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I cannot argue with that. That is definitely a special situation. I mean, it's just a third rail, and you see it. I mean, across the political spectrum, as you noted, in the last few years, there's been a little bit more criticism, and periodically the media will publish something that's mildly surprising, but boy, it's a pretty rock solid consensus, and anybody who goes near it gets whacked. So, okay, so I've taken more of your time than I expected, but I have to ask you one final question. It's a big one too, but it's about your latest book, The Hell of Good Intentions, America's Foreign Policy Elites and the Decline of U.S. Primacy. So, if I can just ask you to sort of lay out quickly your broad thesis, and I have a question, which is, you talk about in the title of the book, the decline of U.S. primacy, and that's always an interesting question. Is the U.S. in a state of decline? And if so, how quickly? I actually think quite quickly, and not 2 years or 5 years, but I mean, to me, you think of that expression of, watching a train wreck. I mean, I look at what's happening. I look at world events. I see, and this may be quite different from the argument you discuss in your book, but again, I look at the situation in Venezuela, and for Russia and China to be openly dissing the United States in what the U.S. has traditionally considered its backyard is sort of surprising. And around the world, you see situations like this. I also find it curious that, not curious, but, and maybe it's just Trump personally, but I think it may be something more. Trump seems to, I look at the way the U.S. is floundering about and lashing out in its foreign policy, and I see that, I interpret that as a decline in U.S. power, and that all we've got left is, the big stick. And that, I see, for example, again, turning to Venezuela, where you just say, we don't recognize your president any longer. We've got a new one for you. And seizure of Venezuela's assets, which, is quite shocking in many ways. And I think, is the U.S. going to be hosting home to the United Nations in 30 or 50 years? I mean, the U.S. is acting in my view, in such a reckless way in so many places, and literally just telling the Venezuelan government, we don't recognize you anymore. I mean, and picking somebody who has no standing in that country. I know I've been to Venezuela 3 times, and I've written about it for over 20 years. But to just simply say, we're taking your money, we're taking over your embassy, and we've changed your president, even though no other country has done that. I mean, the Maduro regime has been, or the Maduro government, actually, I don't want to say regime because I think that the connotation there, I was recently in Venezuela. I'm not a fan of Maduro, and yet the word regime conjures up North Korea or other governments that I think are far, far worse than the Venezuelan government, as bad as I have a pretty negative image. But I look at how the U.S. is acting, and I just think, why is the rest of the world going to put up with this? If you can do that to Venezuela, then what's to keep them from doing it to, China down the road? I mean, actually, that may be extreme. I mean, China is too big to be pushed around, but I think a lot of countries have got to be wondering, why is the UN and why should the U.S. be, have such a powerful role when it's acting so recklessly? Anyway, I asked you a ton of questions there. First, talk about your book, and then second, talk about, whether I'm off my rocker in my interpretation here. And thirdly, talk about, the state of, where are we in the decline of U.S. primacy? How, and I know, of course, you can't answer that question scientifically, but are we in an advanced state of decline, or are we just at the start of the decline?
Okay, I'll end with that set of topics. So the hell of good intentions. This book is trying to answer the question of sort of what went wrong. If you go back to the 1990s, there was this period of enormous optimism. Relations among the major powers are all pretty good. Democracy is spreading, markets are expanding. Iraq is being disarmed. Iran has no nuclear capabilities. The Oslo peace process is underway, so we think there's going to be peace in the Middle East. The European Union is expanding. We're getting told we're at the end of history, right? It's just going to be a wonderful, boring, beneficial life. Everybody's going to get along. And then you look at the world of today, right? We have bad relations with Russia, bad relations with China. Democracy is in retreat now. That you can actually show pretty objectively. Several countries have tested nuclear weapons. Iran is very close to having nuclear weapons if it ever wants them. The two-state solution is further away than ever. The Afghan war continues, etc. The Iraq war was a disaster, etc. So I was saying, what went wrong here? We were very optimistic 25 years ago. And I argue that while the United States is not solely responsible for all that, our fingerprints are on a lot of those problems. And it was basically, the taproot was our attempt to spread the American system worldwide, to create a liberal global order through a strategy of sort of liberal hegemony. And by liberal, I don't mean left wing, I mean liberal as in the classic English liberal values: democracy, human rights, rule of law, market economy, things like that, which are all, in my view, good things, but trying to spread them and trying to do that quickly is not a very good strategy. Of course, this strategy is liberal hegemony because it sees the United States as the indispensable nation that has to lead this process and run this emerging world order. And this has been an almost complete disaster for a variety of different reasons. When it, first of all, poisoned the relationship with Russia and China. It created failed states in a variety of places. Regime change didn't lead to democracy. As we should have known in advance, it would instead create chaos in places like Iraq or Libya or elsewhere. Globalization, which is also part of this, opening up markets as rapidly as possible, didn't deliver as promised. Very good for India and China and some other countries. It was very good for the 1% here in the United States. It's not so good for everybody else. And it also, I think, led to the 2008 financial crisis in various ways. And the central argument of the book is we did this because the American foreign policy elite, both Republican and Democratic, was strongly committed to this. That they succumbed to a certain form of hubris, and therefore, the institutions of government, think tanks, lobbies, most of the media, even large parts of academia, all got behind this idea and kept trying it, kept pursuing it, even when the failures began piling up. And they did this in a variety of ways. Because what's interesting is the public wasn't really supportive of it. The public was always more skeptical. One of the points I make is that the last 4 presidents all ran for office promising to be less involved in the world. That was Clinton, it's the economy stupid. Bush, a humble foreign policy. Obama, let's do nation building at home. And Trump, of course, very critical of all this. But once they get in office, they all find it impossible to resist the urge to try and change the world and sort of remake it in America's image. And so the book sort of lays out how this works. The final thing that goes on, of course, is this is also an elite, and we talked about it to some degree, that rarely, if ever, holds itself accountable. So it doesn't matter how many times you screw up, you can always get a job. The next time the political stars realign. And of course, John Bolton would be a perfect example. In fact, I talk about Elliot Abrams, another good example, explicitly in the book. Now, what does that mean for American primacy? Why is that in the title? Well, I still think the United States has enormous advantages, right? We still, have a very favorable geographic position, a diverse economy, still quite innovative in a variety of ways. Relatively young population compared to some other major powers. So the United States actually has enormous potential. We're going to remain a major world power for a long time. That said, we have certainly squandered a number of our advantages and created opportunities for others in a variety of ways. We've spent somewhere approximating $5 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's the full cost of those wars. And there's a lot of useful things we could have done with that money. Our policies have created enormous instability in the Middle East, which we now feel compelled to have to deal with. We have driven Russia and China closer together so that they're cooperating in a variety of ways. I think American policy in the Middle East is one of the reasons the 9/11 attack happened. That's not to justify a terrorist attack on the United States, but it is to understand its origin. So the whole war on terror is in a sense a cost we think that's been a consequence of our foreign policy. And I could go on, but I think if we'd had a more restrained foreign policy, a more far-sighted one, one that didn't try to transform the world in America's image, the United States would be in better shape today. Here at home, we would have been able to address a number of emerging problems. We would not have alienated countries the way we have in a variety of ways. And some parts of the world would actually be in better shape than they are now. So it wouldn't be a perfect world, but the American position in it would be better than it is today. And the last point I'd make about this is, some of this is why we end up with somebody like Trump. That by 2016, enough Americans began to recognize that this whole approach wasn't working, and they were willing to take a flyer on somebody who was just as critical of what the United States was doing around the world as many Americans were privately. And so despite the fact that somebody like Trump really had no answers for this, and there were lots of reasons to question his character, there were enough Americans who liked what he was saying and were willing to take a chance on it.
Right. Yeah, and I have a feeling, and we'll bring this to a close because I'm excited. You also agreed to do a brief 6-question interviews, which we'll publish on the website. So feel free to, if you want to change any of the questions that I sent you, or to expand on something you've said here, feel free to do that. But I'm glad we're going to also be getting your views, not only here on the podcast, but in an interview that we'll publish next week. But I wonder, I look at the 2020 election, and I still think we're going to have to deal with Trump for another 4 years because he, I don't see any. You never know. Nobody foresaw Obama, but I don't really see any inspiring Democrats. Trump, like him or not, is a very good communicator with, there's a large chunk of the country. I mean, 40, 42, 44% that he speaks to. And he is, whatever his flaws, and I'm not a fan of the man at all. I didn't vote. I couldn't bring myself to vote for Hillary or Trump, and especially in Washington, D.C., where I know, the Electoral College vote is going to go to the Democratic candidate. But, I just couldn't bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton, and I never would have voted for Trump. But like him or not, I mean, we're going to have to deal with him, I think, for some of the reasons you discuss. I mean, he does manage to, speak to part of the electorate that just, the part of the electorate that is fed up, frustrated. To me, Trump is not the problem. He's a symptom of the problem. And he capitalized on the general disgust with the state of American politics and, domestic and foreign policy. And, there was nobody better. He was, in some ways, I think, it was a protest vote of a sort. Everybody said the media had already coronated Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, and the American public didn't want that coronation and rejected both of them, and took a guy who, again, whatever one thinks of his policies, but he speaks to people who are frustrated with the state of affairs, the current state of affairs. So I expect we're going to have him around for another 4 years, personally. But anyway, go ahead.
He should not be underestimated at all. His great asset in 2016, of course, and it remains one today, is he doesn't sound like a politician.
Right.
He's so combative and politically correct that people look at that and say, well, at least I know he's telling me what he really thinks. It's the old joke, how do you make it in Hollywood? Sincerity. And if you can fake that, you've got it. Trump is good at faking authenticity. And that's, something I think he learned early on in life. He has the advantage of incumbency, which is huge. He has the advantage that he doesn't have any opponents in the Republican Party, so he can focus all of his attention on whoever the Democratic rival might be. And he has been, I think, quite gifted at manipulating media, right? That he puts the shining object out there and they chase after it in various ways, and they've still not learned quite how to deal with a political figure like this. But let me give you a few reasons why he might face some trouble. One is that he is an exhausting president.
Yes.
Right, and that people may get tired of this, right? That it's a media circus, but there's plenty of hit shows that eventually people just get bored. They've seen this movie so many times, they get tired of it.
Right.
Can't watch another episode of this thing, and so he may wear out our tolerance faster than others might. Second, you never know in a political campaign who might turn out to be sort of Trump's kryptonite.
Right.
That who has the just as he turned out to be extremely good at going after people like Marco Rubio or like that, it's quite possible that one of the Democratic candidates just turns out to be can perform the sort of nice jujitsu on Trump in various ways. I think the way to do that, of course, is always by making fun of him. He's not a man with a sense of humor. He's not someone who's fast on his feet in that regard. And there's a fat target there, and I mean that literally.
Yes.
The third thing is we do not know what the millennial turnout is going to be, but it's not going to be pro-Trump. That is to say, he is not particularly popular with younger generations. And we've seen in the midterm election, in particular, in a number of places, right, enthusiasm and energy and turnout among millennials helped just balance. So that could play a critical role. And then the last thing, of course, is events. All right, if the stock market decides to take a dive 3 months before the election and suddenly robs him of this line of argument, if some of these adventures we've talked about in places like the Persian Gulf go south in different ways and embarrass the president, expose his incompetence, that's going to be an issue as well. So, in a sense, yes, incumbency is a huge advantage, but it also can leave you vulnerable to things that may happen between now and election day.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, I think those are interesting arguments, and I expect him to win, but those are unknown for sure. I've argued the same. I mean, events, you can't foresee what's going to happen, and yes, unexpected sharp dip in the stock market and economy could, fundamentally alter the outcome. No question about the millennials. I mean, I travel a lot. I also have kids who are millennials, and he is distinctly unpopular. The problem I see is that, Joe Biden is not, going to bring out the millennial vote either. And I don't see many Democrats who are likely to get through the primary process anyway, who are going to bring out the millennial vote. I mean, the most obvious exception is Bernie Sanders, but I don't know. Something tells me Bernie is not going to be able to win the Democratic nomination. I could be wrong. Who knows? It wouldn't be the first time, but I think he's, despised by the political establishment and the Democratic Party, as was openly pro-Hillary in 2016. I think he's too scary to the editorial boards of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I just have there are various other issues, but he actually, oddly enough, despite his age, does mobilize millennials. But I don't know. We'll see. It'd be interesting. It would be a very interesting election if Bernie got through, because the debates would certainly be fun to watch. So anyway, on that note, I thank you for your time. I expected to take much less of it, but I appreciate all of it. It was an interesting conversation, and I look forward to keep staying in touch.
The following has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon.
It's common to find corrupt members of Congress, but Senator Marco Rubio, really, I can't think of anyone dirtier. Going back to his early days, his brother-in-law, as I recall, was a coke trafficker, and young Marco, as a teenager, used to, as I recall, walk the dogs and mow the lawn of the brother-in-laws. The thing is, you could say, well, he was just the dog walker or the lawnmower, but this was a major coke trafficker, and little Marco never noticed anything funny. They were dealing a ton of, I don't want to say 2,000 pounds. It probably was more. I don't really know. It was a major drug trafficking operation, and little Marco was too goddamn stupid to notice anything, or maybe he did notice something, and they paid him, $100 an hour to walk the dogs. I can't answer that question, but that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at. There are so many. He has a long-time association with one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida. And when you say one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida, I don't even know what compares to that. In the city of New Orleans, in the city of Chicago, in the outer circles of hell. David Rivera, they are long-time party friends, love to party, love to go out on the town and have a good time, love to consort with lobbyists. He's a family man, so I would not want to cast aspersions on he or Mr. Rivera. However, if one were to do a Google search, one would find some very interesting things. I've written a few things about Mr. Rubio. I won't call him Senator Rubio. That's a degraded term as it is. But this is a guy who, I wrote a story for the New York Observer. Anybody can Google my name, Marco Rubio, and I did a few stories, but one in particular will come up about his real estate transactions, where, let's just say he obtained his first house. I think he had 3 houses. I can't remember how many lady friends. Just friends. I mean, not saying they were girlfriends or lovers. I'm just saying they were intimate companions. Good family man. So I wouldn't want to suggest in any way there was more than that. But you can read my New York Observer piece where he declined comment on anything having to do with how he obtained housing, his homes very, 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 very cheaply, and always managed to make money on these real estate transactions where campaign donors or bankers he knew or people who might, again, I don't want to cast aspersions, but people who might want favors from Mr. Rubio helped him out. There was a crooked doctor involved in one of these transactions, a Medicare fraudster. He's got a lot of interesting friends. And he had no comment about this. I mean, if I were called and said, are you a crook? And do you like to party with David Rivera? And do you have some intimate lobbyist female companions? I don't care personally what people do in their private lives, but if you're a U.S. senator, as Mr. Rubio is, a lot of what he does has the appearance of impropriety. So I'll be looking into the dirty, dirty past of this man, but I'll be also focusing on his disgusting role as the chief cheerleader and sponsor of the attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela. I mean, I would say the 3 most powerful individuals all should be rotting in jail cells are Rubio, John Bolton, and Elliot Abrams. And Rubio was there first. I mean, Trump ultimately bears responsibility for the criminal sanctions that are punishing the people of Venezuela, strangling the country, and not harming the leadership. And no question, there is serious corruption among the leadership in the Venezuelan government. I mean, that's not even open to question. However, they're not hurting President Maduro in any way. I understand why the Venezuelan people are tired and exhausted, and they are not happy necessarily with President Maduro. But I have been to Venezuela a few months ago, and I'll be going back as part of my reporting, in addition to going down to Florida. So we very definitely need to raise some money for this story. The situation there, I'm not going to say it's 100% the cause of the United States, but you read newspaper stories where they say the people are starving. Well, the government does give a monthly food basket to everybody in the poor areas, which is most of the country. I saw it with my own eyes and wrote about it at Washington, Babylon, Caracas Chronicles. If you Google that and Washington, Babylon, you'll find this story. You'll find pictures. I was in the poor areas where I was, fed, well taken care of. I'm not going to say Venezuela is a paradise. Of course it's not. It's a very difficult situation. It's complicated, but if there's any man who is evil in regard to his conduct towards Venezuela, it's Marco Rubio. I mean, you have to sort of wonder, because he's, famously, his family were Cuban fascists, anti-Castro. but I don't know why he's got a hard-on for Venezuela. I mean, and this is one of the things I'll be looking at. Something's there. You know, maybe he took some dirty money, speculation, of course, from a Venezuelan businessman close to the government and got burned on the deal. I don't know what his obsession is. And lastly, I am also going to be focusing on his best friend in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez, praised in the U.S. media as a hero and a freedom fighter. I can guarantee you this guy is going to look very, very ugly when I'm done with my reporting. His family is extremely rich. They own a lot of property. I don't believe all that property was obtained legally or that they've disclosed the ownership of it. And Leopoldo Lopez is a party goer just like Marco Rubio. You know, Marco used to mow the lawn for coke traffickers. I don't know. I mean, I've just heard stories. It may have just been NyQuil, but, you know, from what I understand, Mr. Lopez, the Trump administration's bitch in Venezuela, and Marco Rubio's God knows what, potentially a business partner, who the hell knows. They are not going to be happy with what I report. That's what I can guarantee you. I can't guarantee you I'll uncover every stone and find every fact, but I will guarantee you that Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and Leopoldo Lopez are going to be pissed off when they see my reporting. All I'm looking for is $1,200 because I know everybody's pressed for money. That's not even going to cover my costs. I'm looking for money elsewhere. I'm trying to find a sponsor that will pay for my plane ticket to Venezuela. I mean, there's $1,200. You know, the expenses aren't going to come close. I got to go to Florida. I'm happy to do it. It's going to be a great reporting trip. Down to Miami, possibly Tallahassee, and to Caracas. So that's not going to be, you know, at $1,200, I'm going to lose. But I'm going to raise other money, and we'll publish some great stories at Washington Babylon, and I'll probably publish a few stories elsewhere to make money because I got to hustle. Because, as you know, journalism is not the most profitable profession unless you are, well, like a lot of our U.S. journalists, not terribly critical or skeptical or honest. And that's, you know, the fastest route to success. But we try to do a little bit better at Washington Babylon.
Preceding has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. Music credits are as follows. The songs Hacienda and Akari were produced and distributed by the website Filmstro, while The Internationale was produced by Jerry Engelbach. All music has been used in this package on the basis of properly recognized and adhered to licenses with their creators. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.